Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, looking forward to the conversation, Alex.
Yeah, so do you just want to start by briefly introducing yourself, sharing why you're running?
Sure. So I'm Daniel Biss. I have the honor of serving as mayor of Evanston. And I'm running because we're in this obscene emergency. Obviously, we in Evanston have experienced directly on our streets what it is to have an occupation of ICE and CBP. And our whole system, our whole society is at risk. I think Jan Schakowsky has served us extraordinarily well for her decades in Congress. And I believe that in determining who needs to replace her, there are two requirements that are both non-negotiable. Number one, someone who knows how to fight and win inside of government. And number two, someone who knows how to fight and win out in the streets as part of protest movements. Let me explain that really quickly. There are a lot of people with good intentions who say the right things and have good positions on issues who get elected to go to Springfield or Washington or whatever government body. They show up, they punch the clock, they vote the right way. They don't really make much of an impact because it's hard. And so I think we need someone who has demonstrated an ability against tough opposition with political risk and a willingness to sacrifice their own career to make tough things happen. And I'm proud to have done that both here in Evanston and in the General Assembly for my 8 years serving in Springfield. But that one criterion is not enough, right? Because we are dealing with a monumental authoritarian menace. And what history shows us is super clear. You don't overturn that just with government people doing the right things inside of government buildings. You need a movement of people out on the streets across the country as part of a broad resistance movement demanding something different. I've been an organizer. In fact, my transition from my previous life as a math professor into politics was through organizing people collectively to make change, riding on school buses up to Wisconsin to knock on doors for the 2004 presidential election. I've been on the streets, tear gassed on the front lines, standing face to face here in Evanston with Greg Bovino, working with activists and other organizations to build up that resistance movement. We need someone who will use this congressional seat to do that work, just as Jan has. In fact, Jan has been both of those things throughout her career. Perhaps that's why she's endorsed my campaign. And I just don't see anybody else in this race who has both of those qualities. There's some who can make the case they've got the one, who have gotten things done in government. There's some who can make the case they've got the other. They're out in the streets trying to make change through activism. There's nobody else who has both. We need both.
Yeah, and you kind of spoke to this, in that introduction, but
I'm sorry, I answered the wrong question at the wrong time.
All good. This is the first time that the 9th District has an open competitive race in over a quarter century. Jan Schakowsky's been here by the end of her term, 28 years. Yeah. You spoke to this some, but what can you take away from Jan Schakowsky's tenure that you want to take into Congress with you? And then, what do you plan to do differently, whether that's a different policy approach or just a different approach to the office and representing the area?
Well, the first list is going to be longer than the second list. A few things. It's funny, when I was talking to Jan and she, was inclined to endorse me, before she made the final determination, she said, I need to ask one thing of you. If I'm going to endorse you, you need to promise to be a badass just like me, right? She's tough. She's not scared of anybody. When I first got to know Jan, it was during the Iraq War, and frankly, a lot of Democrats were scared to tell the truth, right? We're pretending to believe George W. Bush's lies about weapons of mass destruction because it wasn't politically safe to tell the truth. Jan was out in the front lines, not just voting the right way, but organizing other Democrats and pushing them along with her. So part of it is just being tough and aggressive and fearless about pushing for the right things and pushing to change what's possible in Washington, knowing that what's going on right now is not an acceptable status quo for us to live within. That's one piece of it. The next piece is talk about having the heart of an organizer, right? You think about the work she did that launched her into politics and organizing, fighting with the grocery industry to get freshness dates on food. You think about the time that she led a group of seniors to chase Jan Schakowsky, the powerful chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, down the street. She understands that movement organizing is a fundamental part of making change, and she has continued to do that work as a member of Congress, not just outsource it to other people. And finally, and we don't talk about this, I think, as much as we should, because Jan is such a fierce advocate for so many key progressive issues. her dedication to constituent service is unlike anybody else I'm aware of in Congress. The quality of her constituent service operation, the responsiveness, their dedication to solving problems, it's really admirable. I've experienced it as a mayor of Evanston, working with her team on behalf of our shared constituents. I experienced it as a legislator. And I think that's really something to aspire to, both because it's just the right thing to do, but also because we are living in this time of such cynicism and distrust. And the first way to rebuild the foundation of trust between people and government, that is then a necessary tool if you're going to actually have a government that's willing to take risks to solve hard problems with bold solutions, is just serve people, respond, be accessible, be a solution machine. And that's something that Jan's team has always done, and that's something that I plan to continue as a member of Congress. Now, we haven't always agreed on everything, and I think the last kind of big disagreement we had was in the summer of 2024 about whether or not Joe Biden should stay on the ticket. And I thought that he ought to leave the ticket. I didn't think that he should have run for re-election. And Jan thought that he should stay on the ticket. And when we've disagreed, we've had honest, productive, sometimes even hard conversations. Even someone like Jan, who I have deep, deep admiration for, who I see as a friend and mentor, I'm willing to stick up for what I believe in. But I also think that her judgment has been really phenomenal. And I look forward as a member of Congress to having a chance to continue to maintain that close relationship and to rely on her for advice and guidance and continued mentorship.
As mentioned, Jan Schakowsky, at the end of her current term, will have served for 28 years. Before her, Sid Yates represented this district for 48 years. If you win, how long could you see yourself staying in this seat? Is there a certain point at which, no matter how well an incumbent has served, it's better to, turn over and bring in a fresh perspective?
Yeah, I don't have an exact number, but I certainly don't see myself serving for either of those numbers of years. I think that there's a balance to be struck. I think experience is real important. There's no question about it. I think about the legislator I was, 2 weeks into my service in Springfield, and the legislator I was 6 and 7 and 8 years. And I learned a ton. I was way more effective. I got way more done. And so, of course, experience matters. But new blood is important and turnover is important. I've made the choice. After I'd been a legislator for 8 years, I felt like, okay, I've learned this job. I've figured out how to do it the way that I want to do it, and now I'm going to move on and try something else. And I think it's important to keep that ethos because government needs to be dynamic, right? Society changes. Problems emerge that were unimaginable 10 years before. It's not just technologies change, ways of living change. And so that needs to be reflected in our government leadership as well.
Yeah. But there isn't like a specific time period, call it 10, 12, 14 years, where you'd be like, okay, like at this point I've had enough, or not had enough, but represented it for long enough.
I think it's quite likely that that's the right ballpark, but what I would say is I think it's really important to make a case-by-case determination, right? It comes time to decide, file petitions or secret petitions to run for re-election or don't. And then you ask, am I doing the job well? Am I still learning? Am I still growing? Are there specific things I want to get done that are really critical that I might be on the verge of doing? Or on the other hand, have I been kind of doing this for a long enough period of time that it feels like I've begun sort of repeating myself and it's time for someone else to take the reins? And I think it's important to ask that question even before running for re-election a first time, and then to ask it seriously every time and make an honest, good faith decision.
So the 9th District is historically very progressive, and the Democratic field that you're a part of reflects this. Between most of the candidates and the leading candidates, there's not immediately a lot of daylight between everyone on a lot of policy issues. What is a policy issue that you feel separates you out from the rest of the field?
Well, let's talk about the issue that's kind of become a flashpoint in this election. I believe in a two-state solution in the Middle East. I have deep connections to Israel. My grandparents on my mother's side survived the Holocaust, came back to the Transylvanian town where they grew up after liberation. My mom was born in 46 and 48. The three of them went to Israel. And by, early 60s, my mom's whole extended family was there. My mother's still a dual citizen. My dad still have an apartment at the address where she grew up in Israel, and they spend time there multiple times a year. So my connection to Israel is real and deep, and my commitment to its continued existence and security as a Jewish democratic state is real and deep. But no less deep is my revulsion at what the Israeli government has done, not only in Gaza, the use of starvation as a weapon, the bombing of schools and hospitals, the killing. But let's be honest, what happened in the West Bank for years before the expansion of settlements against U.S. policy and international law, by the way, the condoning of settler violence. And so when I say I support a two-state solution, I don't mean that as a slogan. I mean, we got to make it happen. We actually need justice. We need peace. We need to treat both Jews and Palestinians as true, legitimate claimants to that part of the world who have equal rights to live with real self-determination, dignity, peace, and security. And we got to be honest about the fact that the current Israeli government is moving us dramatically away from that in ways that are, in my opinion, even just in conflict with basic Jewish values. The U.S. has tried for decades to kind of say to Netanyahu, hey, listen, we wish you would do something different. We wish you would follow U.S. policy and international law. But if you don't, there will be no consequences. That doesn't work. It hasn't worked. It won't work. So that's why I support the Block the Bombs resolution, which is a first step towards saying, hey, there can't be a blank check of military aid. That's not a sensible foreign policy to have relative to any country in the world. And I support the recognition of a Palestinian state, to plant a flag in the ground and say, listen, we need to actually have U.S. policy move us toward the goal that we say that we want, not just turn a blind eye as that goal becomes increasingly remote and increasingly implausible. So there's differences on these issues. Kat has not come out in support of a two-state solution, and Laura Fine, whose campaign is entirely bankrolled by AIPAC, the lobby that supports candidates who support the policies of the current Israeli government, the lobby that supports candidates only who promise that blank check of military aid to Israel. She has said, I'm for a blank check. I oppose any restrictions on military aid. And I think it's an important distinction in a district that cares about this issue. And I think it's one that has become increasingly relevant to people, as not only is it a clear area of policy difference, but people are wondering, why is an out-of-state group with such right-wing connections, such MAGA connections, entirely bankrolling the campaign of somebody running in a progressive district in a Democratic primary? Why would it be that a candidate who's been a state legislator here for 13 years has more money last quarter from Trump donors than from our district? I think that's raising a lot of questions, and it's becoming a key issue on a lot of folks' minds.
Well, bringing up AIPAC, there's been a lot of reporting and discussion about the organization's support and fundraising for Laura Fine, but it's also been reported and come out that very early in the campaign you had engaged with them a little bit, sent them a position paper. You've released that position paper at this point, but why engage with them in the first place early on in the campaign?
I engage with all kinds of people I disagree with. I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. That's how I intend to continue to lead as the congressman from this district, talking and having open dialogue, even trying to listen openly and build bridges with anyone. By the way, I didn't ask for their support. I wouldn't have accepted their support, but I wanted them to stay out. I think what they're doing now is bad for our community. And so I'm not embarrassed of the fact that I, in fact, would have liked them to stay out of this race. I think it would have been better for all of us. But I think it's really important not to take a position that you shouldn't have conversations with organizations you disagree with. I think we want somebody in this office who can talk to anyone. And it's also important that we have someone in this office who, when talking to anyone, holds firm to their values, right? It was very clear that I could have changed my position and then gotten their support and been the one benefiting from millions of dollars of dark money ads from super PACs and money from MAGA donors all across the country. That was available to me. I said no. I said, here's what I stand for. I said, here's what I believe, because I think this district deserves someone who's going to stick to their values, not just follow the money.
So whoever wins this seat will still be one member of the House out of 435. And as a freshman and member of Congress, they won't immediately have a lot of direct congressional experience or clout or whatever you want to call it to advance a policy agenda immediately. So what are two or three items that you think you can actually make progress on, as a freshman in Congress in your first 2 years?
Look, the problem with my first 2 years is Donald Trump is going to be the president, right? So let's just be honest about the continued authoritarian assault on our core beliefs and values, and the fact that we're going to need to be fighting back against that. So first of all, if I join Congress as a member, let's hope, of a Democratic majority, that Democratic majority is going to be a key player in governing the country, basically in negotiation with Donald Trump. And the question is, are we going to be tough enough? Are we going to be strong enough? Are we going to hold firm? Or are we going to cave, as has too often happened in the course of the first year of this Trump term? So I have a record of standing strong, with backbone, with courage, encouraging others and persuading others around me to do the same. And that's what I'm going to do as a member of a Democratic majority, pushing back against Trump. By the way, a Democratic majority can also engage in oversight, in hearings, in impeachments, in using the subpoena power, in bringing to light what's happening and articulating to the country what's going on, and then using that information to achieve accountability and to produce a to-do list of what policy changes need to be made to ensure this can never happen again, because we cannot allow this to happen again. I do want to say that I understand in that environment, there are going to be limits to what Democrats can get done, but there's some basic things that ought to be doable. Like, even if we can't abolish ICE when Donald Trump is the president, we can still hold firm on diminishing the budget. The amount of money that was thrown at ICE with the bill they passed last summer, the massive expansion, people being recruited from God knows where and then given a gun and no training and sent on our streets to terrorize our neighbors, we ought to be able to effectuate a significant rollback in that funding. And let's start on the simple stuff. Get the masks off. Get the masks off, right? It is antithetical to the basic principles of democracy to have anonymous, masked agents of the state deploying state violence, right? The core principle here, what are we as a democracy, right? We give a monopoly on certain powers to government, right? Government can do things like tax and arrest and incarcerate. You and I can't do that. In exchange for those awesome powers, government consents to oversight, to transparency, to accountability. If you have what ICE and CBP have now, which is the power without the transparency or the accountability, you don't have a democracy anymore. And so everybody ought to be able to agree that get the masks off, have identification, and have real accountability.
There's been reporting even just today or in the last few days about the DHS funding bill, talking about take the masks off. It seems like even Democratic leadership right now, Hakeem Jeffries, Chuck Schumer, are wavering on those kinds of points. Even if the Democrats take back the House, you're still going to be one member of a much larger and divergent caucus. Yeah. What would be your approach to working within that, whether it's working with Democrats or working with or dealing with Republicans in the House? And the 9th District being a very blue and progressive district, do you feel it would be like your responsibility or your right or whatever to try to pull people in the caucus to the left, or would you try to work with them where they are, meet them in the middle more directly?
So as a member of a majority caucus in the House, you're one of 218 or more people, and that group has to coalesce to somewhere. And what the voters in this primary are choosing is somebody who's going to play some role in that coalescing process. And I think there's a right way to do it, which is to fight for what you believe in by making relationships and coming to understand other people and earning their trust. Not by just sort of taking a back seat and doing nothing, or kind of saying, well, I'll go along with whatever the group decides. Not by saying it's my way or the highway, and I'm not going to talk to you if you don't see it my way, but by saying, here's what I believe, here's what I think is right, and here's what I'm going to do to persuade others Not that they ought to cave in to me, but that actually this is the right way forward for the country. And I mean, again, let me just be super blunt here. A lot of legislators just don't do that work. It's not the thing that drives them. It's not the thing that motivates them to run. If you look at how I handled myself as a member of the General Assembly, that's what I was doing. I was building coalitions. I was building bridges to people who didn't quite see things exactly like me, but we had enough common ground that we could work things out. I was getting to know people personally and their districts and their families to understand how to build that broader possible coalition. And there were critical moments in Springfield, not only in passing my own bills, but in helping us make a collective decision as a group, like when Bruce Rauner was governor, where my leadership was critical in holding the group together and making sure that we were unified and strong in pushing back against a really dangerous governor.
So where do you draw the line on what are you able to compromise on? What are you able to, meet others in the middle on, and what aren't you willing to compromise on?
I think it's really hard but important to walk into a legislative context with an open mind, because your job is to deliver as much as possible for the people who you're serving, right? So I was able to work with people in Springfield who we would work together on one bill, and then the next bill that came up would be a bill about denying my kids access to healthcare, and they would be on the wrong side of that. That's real personal, right? That's really emotional. And I had to be able to say, in order to move forward an agenda that really matters for the people I'm serving, I can't allow that personal hurt to get in the way of my willingness to work with you on things where we might agree. And so that's the approach I take. I don't make it about me. I make it about what can I do given this sacred trust, this weird job, right, as a member of a legislature where your official role is just voting yes or no on a bunch of things, but your unofficial role is creatively trying to find ways to make a difference. What can I do to actually make change? So that when I leave this place, what actually occurred, the life that the people who I'm serving live, the laws in this country aren't just the same as they would have been had anybody else with the same values as me been in the office, but rather I made an impact because I was able to find a coalition others didn't see, or come up with an idea that wasn't initially obvious, but that really helped move things forward. I think that requires a lot of open-mindedness and flexibility.
Yeah. So going from, time in the General Assembly to your time as mayor, it's been about a year since you and I sat in this room and spoke.
Over there, though.
We're a different part of the room, but, spoke about your re-election campaign for mayor. And when we spoke then, you said that your plan was, quote, to serve out this term. Turn back the clock about 9 months or so. You won re-election as mayor on April 1st. 45 days later, May 15th, you announced your run for Congress. How do you explain, that decision to run for Congress so quickly to voters here in Evanston, and what moved in your mind to go from one to the other?
Well, I was crystal clear at all times that I didn't know what would happen. I will say very simply, we're in an emergency. We're in an emergency. The situation in Washington is a crisis. It's a nuclear level disaster for the country. We need the right people in Congress. And I don't know anybody in this community who disagrees with that. And so I was presented with the question, do I play a role in fixing that? Or do I just sort of back away from the opportunity to do the most good for this community? And ultimately, it wasn't a hard choice. It wasn't a hard choice. So I don't know. To me, it's not much of a question, frankly. I don't know that I could have done anything different and maintained my basic promise to the community of I'm always going to do the most that I can to solve the most critical problem. Now, by the way, I think there's an implied question in there. I did not know that Jan was not going to run for re-election when I decided to run for re-election as mayor. I didn't know that Jan was not going to run for re-election when you and I had that conversation. some people who are skeptical would say, well, there were rumors. And it's like, I've been hearing rumors about Jan retiring for 10 years, for 15 years. And I just don't find those parlor games respectful or productive. I focus on the question of what's in front of me now. How can I use the situation in front of me to do the most good for my community? And at every time, I've made a decision based on that. And I think I've made the right decision in both instances.
Prior to coming to run as mayor, while you were serving in the state Senate, you ran for governor in 2018. There's obviously a lot of rumors now about Governor Pritzker potentially running for president in 2028. But if he were to resign for that, or if any other statewide office were to open up, while you're a member of Congress, would you consider running for any of those?
I doubt it. I've never gotten that question before, so I haven't thought about it, but I very much doubt it. That experience running for governor was an extraordinary experience. I learned so much. I'm really proud of what we did, but I don't know. I don't really know that I have it in me to ever do that again. So I doubt it.
So you feel like, Congress for you, if you were to be elected, we already spoke about, 10, 12, 14 years, whatever, but there isn't, you're saying, a higher office that you would feel inclined to run for in the future?
Yeah, I think the right answer, certainly I would feel no inclination. I suppose you should say never, but I kind of don't see it.
So just today, mail ballots are starting to go out to voters across the district. Early voting's open in Lake and McHenry County. As voters are making their decision in the 9th District race, what do you want them to keep in mind?
I'll land where I began. We need two different things in this moment. Neither one is negotiable. Someone who knows how to fight and win and make things happen in government, things that wouldn't have happened had somebody else with the same values, but less persistence, less political courage, less coalition building ability been in the role. And we need someone who understands the role of activism and organizing and protest and is willing to put their body on the line and motivate a resistance movement across the region and across the country. I believe that we cannot compromise on either of those qualities, and I'm the only candidate in this race who has both of those qualities. That's why I believe I'm the best person for this seat. I think maybe that's why Jan Schakowsky endorsed me recently, and it's why I'm asking for the support of every person in this district to help me be successful and win, but then to govern together collaboratively, knowing that we are not going to solve the problems we have just by sending the right person by themselves. We're going to do it together.
All right. Thank you so much for talking with me.
Thanks, Alex.